The millionaire CEO fakes passing out in his office to catch whoever's been stealing from him. But what he overhears his secretary confess on the phone leaves everyone in complete shock. What city are you in? Drop it below and subscribe. Here comes an emotional story with a finale you won't believe. Alexander Mercer had built his empire from nothing. At 32 years old, he was the CEO of Mercer Industries, a tech conglomerate worth over $3 billion. His corner office on the 40th floor of the Manhattan skyscraper bore witness to countless deals that had shaped the industry. But lately, something was wrong. Money was disappearing. Not huge amounts at first, a few thousand here, 10,000 there. But over the past 6 months, the leaks had grown into a hemorrhage. Nearly $2 million had vanished through shell accounts and falsified invoices, and Alexander was determined to find out who was responsible. He had narrowed it down to someone with executive access, someone close to him. And today he was going to catch them. His plan was unconventional, perhaps even absurd, but Alexander hadn't become a billionaire by playing it safe. He was going to fake a medical emergency right here in his office and see who revealed themselves when they thought he couldn't hear. His secretary, Rachel Bennett, had been with the company for 2 years. She was 26, with warm brown eyes and auburn hair that she always kept in a neat bun during work hours. She was efficient, organized, and had an almost supernatural ability to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. Alexander had always appreciated her professionalism, though he'd be lying if he said he hadn't noticed how beautiful she was. But beauty meant nothing if she was the one stealing from him. He'd reviewed the access logs. Rachel had clearance to all the accounts that had been compromised. She was his primary suspect. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows as Alexander prepared for his performance. He'd already instructed his head of security, Marcus Webb, to have the office cameras recording and to stay close but out of sight. At exactly 10:15, Rachel knocked on his door with his morning coffee, just as she did every day. Alexander took a deep breath. It was showtime. Rachel entered the office, carrying a ceramic mug with steam rising from it. She was wearing a navy blue dress that hugged her figure modestly but flatteringly, and her usual string of pearls, a graduation gift from her late grandmother. She had no idea that her boss was about to collapse in front of her, or that the next few hours would change both of their lives forever. Alexander accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, took a sip, and then set it down on his desk. He waited until Rachel had turned toward the door before he let out a strangled gasp and crumpled to the floor, making sure to fall behind his desk, where he'd be partially hidden, but could still hear everything in the room. Rachel spun around at the sound. Her eyes went wide with horror as she saw her boss lying motionless on the carpet. She rushed to his side immediately, dropping to her knees beside him. Alexander kept his eyes closed and his breathing shallow. He could smell her perfume, something light and floral, as she leaned over him. Her fingers pressed against his neck, checking for a pulse, and he had to fight not to react to her touch. He heard her fumbling with her phone, presumably to call for help. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of dialing emergency services, Rachel made a different call. Her voice was shaking as she spoke. Alexander strained to hear every word, his heart pounding despite his efforts to appear unconscious. "Mom, it's me. I need you to listen carefully. Mr. Mercer just collapsed in his office. I think he might be having a heart attack or something. I'm about to call the paramedics, but I needed to tell you something first in case everything falls apart after this." Alexander's mind raced. This was it. She was about to confess. "I know I promised I wouldn't say anything, but I can't keep this secret anymore. It's eating me alive. The money, Mom. The money I've been sending you. It's not from a second job like I told you. I've been investigating something here at the company. Something illegal." Alexander's eyes almost flew open in shock, but he caught himself just in time. "There's someone high up in this company who's been embezzling millions. I found out about it 6 months ago, when I accidentally accessed a file I wasn't supposed to see. I've been gathering evidence ever since, but I couldn't go to the police or even to Mr. Mercer, because I wasn't sure who else was involved. For all I knew, he could have been part of it too." Rachel's voice cracked with emotion. The money I've been sending you isn't stolen, Mom. I swear to God it isn't. It's from my savings. I've been working double shifts at the diner on weekends and selling my paintings online just like I used to. But I told you it was a second job at a law firm because I didn't want you to worry. I didn't want you to know your daughter was playing detective in a multi-billion-dollar corporation, trying to catch a thief, while terrified that she'd be the one who ended up in prison. Tears were streaming down Rachel's face now. She was still kneeling beside Alexander, one hand resting on his chest to monitor his breathing. If something happens to Mr. Mercer, if he dies, the investigation might never be completed, and the real criminal will get away with everything. I have all the evidence on a flash drive hidden in my apartment. If anything happens to me, it's taped under the bottom drawer of my nightstand. Promise me you'll get it to the FBI. Promise me, Mom. She paused, listening to whatever her mother was saying on the other end of the line. I love you too. I have to go now. I need to call for help. Rachel ended the call and immediately dialed 911, her voice professional and steady as she reported the emergency. But Alexander had heard enough. His mind was reeling with the implications of what she'd just confessed. She wasn't the thief. She was trying to catch the thief. She'd been working in secret for 6 months, sacrificing her weekends and her savings, all to protect his company. And she'd been sending money to her mother, not stolen funds, but her own hard-earned cash. He felt like the world's biggest fool. For weeks he'd suspected this woman of betraying him, when in reality she'd been his most loyal employee. The guilt was overwhelming, but beneath it, something else stirred. Admiration, respect, and something warmer that he didn't want to examine too closely. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. Alexander knew he couldn't maintain his ruse much longer, so he allowed himself to regain consciousness just as they were loading him onto a stretcher. He made a show of being disoriented, insisting that he felt fine and that it must have been a momentary spell of dizziness. The paramedics wanted to take him to the hospital for observation, but Alexander refused. He signed the waiver against medical advice and sent them away, claiming he had too much work to do. Through it all, Rachel stayed by his side. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but she'd composed herself remarkably well. She fetched him water, adjusted the blinds to reduce the glare, and hovered anxiously as if afraid he might collapse again at any moment. Once they were alone, Alexander studied her with new eyes. This woman had risked everything to protect his company. She'd worked herself to exhaustion, given up her weekends, depleted her savings, all without any expectation of recognition or reward, and he had suspected her of being a criminal. He needed to make this right, but first, he needed to know everything she knew about the real embezzler. The question was how to approach her without revealing that he'd been eavesdropping on her private phone call. He decided on a direct approach, or at least as direct as he could manage without admitting to his deception. "Rachel," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Sit down. We need to talk." She looked startled but complied, settling into the chair across from his desk. Her hands were folded in her lap, and he noticed they were trembling slightly. "I've been meaning to discuss something with you," Alexander continued, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know if you're aware, but there have been some financial irregularities in the company lately, significant ones. I have reason to believe someone with executive access has been embezzling funds." Rachel's face went pale. For a moment, Alexander thought she might faint, but then something shifted in her expression, a resolve hardening behind her eyes. She took a deep breath and met his gaze directly. "I know," she said quietly. "I know about the embezzlement. I've known for 6 months, and I know who's responsible." Alexander leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Tell me." Rachel hesitated, glancing toward the door as if afraid someone might be listening. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small flash drive, the same one she'd mentioned to her mother on the phone. She placed it on his desk between them, her fingers lingering on it for just a moment before she pulled her hand back. "Everything is on there," she said. "Bank records, falsified invoices, email correspondence, transfer logs. 6 months of evidence that proves beyond any doubt who's been stealing from you." She paused, and when she spoke again, Her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's David Chen, your chief financial officer, your best friend since college. And before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your city in the comments below, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe for more. Now, let's see what happens next." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. David Chen. They'd been roommates at Stanford, had started their first business together in a cramped garage apartment, had stood as best men at each other's weddings, though Alexander's marriage had ended in divorce 3 years ago. David was godfather to Alexander's niece. They played golf together every Sunday. And now Rachel was telling him that this man, this brother in everything but blood, had been systematically robbing him blind. "You're certain?" Alexander asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Rachel nodded, her expression sympathetic but resolute. "I've triple-checked everything. The trail is complicated. He's been careful, but it all leads back to him. He's been funneling money through a series of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, using shell companies to make the transactions look legitimate. He started small, probably testing the waters, but in the last 3 months alone he's taken over $800,000. Alexander picked up the flash drive and turned it over in his hands. Such a small object to contain such devastating proof. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" The question came out harsher than he'd intended, and he saw Rachel flinch. She deserved better than his anger. She'd done nothing wrong. If anything, she'd done everything right. "I wanted to," she said softly. "You have no idea how many times I almost walked into this office and told you everything, but I wasn't sure. I didn't know if you were involved." The admission hung in the air between them. Alexander felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over him. He'd suspected her of theft, and she'd suspected him of the same. They'd both been wrong. "I would never steal from my own company," he said firmly. "I built this place with my own 2 hands. Every brick, every contract, every employee. I take responsibility for all of it. Money has never been the point for me. It's about creating something that matters, something that lasts." Rachel's eyes softened. "I know that now. I've watched you for 2 years, Mr. Mercer. I've seen how you treat the cleaning staff with the same respect you give the board members. I've seen you stay late to help junior employees with their projects. I've seen you donate millions to charity without ever seeking recognition for it." She paused, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I realized about 4 months ago that you couldn't possibly be involved, but by then I was already so deep into the investigation that I was afraid to trust anyone. I thought if I told you, word might get back to David somehow, and he'd cover his tracks before I could gather enough evidence." Alexander set down the flash drive and leaned back in his chair, studying the young woman before him. She was remarkable. Most employees in her position would have ignored the irregularities, too afraid of getting involved or losing their job. Instead, Rachel had taken it upon herself to uncover the truth, working in secret for half a year, sacrificing her personal time and depleting her savings to protect a company that wasn't even hers. "Thank you," he said quietly. The words felt inadequate, but he meant them with every fiber of his being. "What you've done, the risk you've taken, I don't know how to repay you." Rachel shook her head. "I don't want repayment. I just want justice. David Chen has been stealing from hard-working people, from employees who depend on this company for their livelihoods, from shareholders who trusted him with their investments. He needs to face the consequences." Alexander nodded slowly. "He will. I'll contact the FBI this afternoon and turn over all your evidence. But Rachel, I need you to understand something. Once this goes public, there will be scrutiny. Reporters will want to know how the embezzlement was discovered. Your name will come out. You'll be called to testify. Are you prepared for that?" For a moment, fear flickered across Rachel's face, but then her jaw set with determination. "I'll do whatever it takes." Something shifted in Alexander's chest as he looked at her, something warm and unexpected. He'd always found Rachel attractive in an abstract way, the same way he might appreciate a beautiful painting or a well-designed car. But now, seeing her courage and integrity up close, he felt drawn to her in a way that went far beyond physical appreciation. This was dangerous territory. She was his employee. There were rules about these things. boundaries that existed for good reason. He pushed the feelings aside and focused on the matter at hand. Over the next few hours, they went through the evidence together. Rachel walked him through every transaction, every falsified document, every digital breadcrumb she'd followed to uncover David's scheme. Her attention to detail was extraordinary. She'd documented everything with the precision of a forensic accountant, leaving no room for doubt or denial. As they worked, Alexander found himself watching her more than the screen. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the gentle curve of her lips when she explained a particularly clever piece of detective work, the passion that lit up her eyes when she talked about bringing David to justice. He was falling for her. He knew it with absolute certainty, even as he knew it was completely inappropriate. She was half a decade younger than him, his subordinate, and they were in the middle of uncovering a massive corporate scandal. This was not the time for romantic entanglements, but the heart rarely listened to reason. By late afternoon, they'd compiled everything into a comprehensive report. Alexander called his personal attorney, who arrived within the hour and confirmed that the evidence was more than sufficient for criminal prosecution. The FBI was contacted, and a meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Through it all, Rachel remained calm and professional, but Alexander could see the exhaustion etched into her features. She'd been carrying this burden alone for 6 months, and the relief of finally sharing it was taking its toll. "Go home," he told her gently as the sun began to set outside his windows. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." Rachel hesitated. "Are you sure you don't need me to stay? There might be more questions, more details to go over." "I'm sure," Alexander interrupted. "You've done more than enough, more than anyone could have asked. Now go home, take a hot bath, and try to get some sleep. That's an order." A small smile tugged at her lips. "Yes, sir." She gathered her things and headed for the door, but paused with her hand on the knob. "Mr. Mercer, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. About David. I know how much he meant to you." The sincerity in her voice made Alexander's throat tighten. "Thank you, Rachel, and please, after everything we've been through today, I think you can call me Alexander." Her smile widened just a fraction. "Good night, Alexander." After she left, Alexander sat alone in his darkening office, staring at the flash drive that contained the evidence of his best friend's betrayal. Tomorrow, he would destroy David Chen's life. He would turn over the evidence, watch the FBI agents lead David away in handcuffs, and then face the media firestorm that would inevitably follow. His company would survive. It was too strong not to, but the scandal would leave scars, and David would go to prison, probably for decades. Part of Alexander wanted to give his old friend a chance to explain, to offer some justification that might make the betrayal easier to understand, but he knew that was weakness talking. David had made his choices. Now he would face the consequences. As he finally rose to leave, Alexander realized that something fundamental had shifted inside him. He'd come into the office that morning planning to catch a thief, expecting to feel vindicated when he exposed Rachel as the criminal he'd believed her to be. Instead, he'd discovered that the woman he'd suspected was actually his greatest ally, and that the man he'd trusted with his life was the true enemy. Life had a way of upending expectations. The next morning arrived cold and grey, with storm clouds gathering over Manhattan like a portent of the day to come. Alexander had barely slept, his mind churning with thoughts of David's betrayal and, increasingly, thoughts of Rachel. She arrived at the office at exactly 8 o'clock, as always. But this morning, instead of her usual professional attire, she was dressed in a simple black dress with minimal jewelry. She looked like she was attending a funeral, which in a way she was. The funeral of Alexander's oldest friendship. The FBI agents arrived at 9. There were 3 of them. 2 men in dark suits with expressionless faces, and a woman with sharp eyes who introduced herself as Special Agent Morrison. She was clearly in charge, and she wasted no time with pleasantries. They reviewed the evidence for over an hour, asking pointed questions that Rachel answered with the same meticulous precision she'd shown Alexander the day before. Special Agent Morrison's expression grew grimmer with each revelation. "This is solid work," she said finally, directing her comment to Rachel. Professional grade. Have you ever considered a career in law enforcement? Rachel blushed. I just followed the trail. Anyone could have done it. No, Morrison said firmly. Anyone couldn't have. Most people would have looked the other way, too afraid of the consequences. What you did took courage. Don't undersell yourself. Alexander felt a swell of pride that had no business being there. Rachel wasn't his to be proud of, but he was proud nonetheless. At 11 o'clock, David Chen walked into the building, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. Alexander watched on the security monitor as his former best friend stepped off the elevator, chatting amiably with one of the junior accountants. David was laughing at something the young man had said, his face open and friendly. He looked like what he'd always been, a charming, successful executive with a ready smile and an easy manner. But Alexander knew now that it was all a mask. The real David Chen was a thief and a liar, someone who could smile at you while picking your pocket. The FBI agents positioned themselves outside Alexander's office as David approached. Rachel stood beside Alexander, her hand trembling slightly as she clutched a folder containing additional documents. When David knocked and entered, his smile faltered almost imperceptibly at the sight of the strangers in the room. "Alex," he said, his voice carefully casual. "I didn't realize you had a meeting. Should I come back later?" "No," Alexander said flatly. "Stay. This concerns you." He watched David's expression shift through confusion to wariness to the first flicker of fear. His old friend had always been quick. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know yet how wrong. Special Agent Morrison stepped forward, her badge gleaming in the fluorescent light. "David Chen, I'm Special Agent Morrison with the FBI. We have some questions for you regarding certain financial irregularities at Mercer Industries." For a long moment, David didn't move. His eyes darted from the agents to Alexander to Rachel, calculating his options. Then, to Alexander's disgust, he laughed. "Is this a joke?" he asked, spreading his hands in a gesture of innocent bewilderment. "Alex, if this is about the quarterly numbers, I told you there were some discrepancies in the accounting software. It's nothing criminal." "We're not talking about accounting software," Morrison said coldly. "We're talking about $2 million that you've funneled through offshore accounts over the past 6 months. We have transaction records, email correspondence, and a paper trail that leads directly to you." All the color drained from David's face. His mask crumbled, replaced by something ugly and desperate. His eyes locked onto Rachel with sudden understanding. "You," he breathed. "You little snake, I should have known. Always hovering around, always asking questions about things that weren't your business." He took a step toward her, and Alexander moved instinctively to place himself between them. "Don't," he warned, his voice like ice. "Don't you dare look at her. Don't speak to her. She did what you should have done. She told the truth." David's expression twisted with rage and betrayal. "I gave 15 years to this company. I helped you build it from nothing. And what do I have to show for it? Stock options that are worth half what they used to be? A salary that hasn't kept up with inflation? I'm your partner, Alex. I deserved more than what you gave me. So you stole from me." Alexander's voice was deadly calm, but inside he was reeling. He'd never known David felt this way. "You stole from the company we built together, from the employees who trusted us, and you're trying to justify it by claiming you deserved better compensation." "I did deserve better," David shouted. "I did everything you asked. I put in the same hours, made the same sacrifices, and you always got all the credit. Alexander Mercer, the boy genius, the visionary entrepreneur. What about me? What about everything I contributed?" Rachel spoke then, her voice quiet but unwavering. "You contributed fraud. You contributed theft. You contributed a betrayal of everyone who believed in you." David turned on her with venom in his eyes. "What would you know about it? You're just a secretary, a nobody. You think because you found a few bank records that you understand anything about what it takes to run a billion-dollar company." "I understand the difference between right and wrong," Rachel replied steadily. "That seems to be more than you do." Special Agent Morrison stepped forward before David could respond. "That's enough. David Chen, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the agents handcuffed him and led him away, David turned back one last time. His eyes met Alexander's, and for just a moment, Beneath all the anger and fear, Alexander saw the boy he'd known at Stanford, the friend who'd stayed up all night helping him study for finals, the partner who'd celebrated every victory and mourned every failure. That boy was gone now, destroyed by his own greed and resentment. In his place was a stranger, someone Alexander didn't recognize and never wanted to see again. After the door closed behind them, the office fell silent. Alexander stood motionless by the window, staring out at the city that had made him rich and powerful, feeling emptier than he'd ever felt in his life. He didn't notice Rachel approaching until she was beside him. She didn't say anything, just stood there, a quiet presence in the midst of his turmoil. Her nearness was oddly comforting, like a candle flame in the darkness. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I know how much he meant to you." Alexander shook his head slowly. "He meant something to a person I used to be. I'm not that person anymore." He turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time since the FBI had arrived. Her face was pale and strained, but her eyes held a compassion that made his chest ache. "Rachel, what you did today, facing him down like that, you didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," she said simply. Someone had to tell him the truth. He needed to hear that his excuses didn't justify his actions. A ghost of a smile crossed Alexander's lips. "You're remarkable, you know that? Most people in your position would have stayed quiet, let the FBI handle everything. But you stood up to him. You called him out for what he'd done." Rachel's cheeks flushed. I was terrified. When he looked at me like that, I've never seen such hatred in anyone's eyes, but I couldn't let him intimidate me. I couldn't let him think that what he'd done was acceptable. Without thinking, Alexander reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, and he felt her stiffen slightly at the contact before she relaxed. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything. For finding the evidence, for having the courage to come forward, for standing with me today. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Rachel's eyes met his, and something electric passed between them. The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with an awareness that had been building for days. "You don't owe me anything," she whispered. "I did what anyone would have done." "No," Alexander said, echoing Morrison's words from earlier. "Anyone wouldn't have. You're special, Rachel. I've known it since the day you started working here. I just didn't realize how special until now." For a long moment they stood there, hands intertwined, the city sprawling below them in all its chaotic splendor. Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a connection, a sense of belonging. With his ex-wife, he'd always felt like he was performing a role. But with Rachel, standing in the wreckage of his oldest friendship, he felt genuinely himself. The moment was broken by a knock at the door. Alexander released Rachel's hand quickly, stepping back to a professional distance as his assistant poked her head in. "Mr. Mercer, the press has gotten wind of the arrest. There are reporters gathering outside the building." Reality came crashing back. The scandal was just beginning, and there would be 1,000 fires to put out before the day was over. Alexander nodded curtly. "Schedule a press conference for 3 o'clock. No interviews before then." As the assistant hurried away, Alexander turned back to Rachel. "I need you to stay out of the public eye for now. The media will try to find out who uncovered the embezzlement, and if they discover it was you, they'll hound you mercilessly." "I can handle it," Rachel said, but Alexander shook his head. "I don't want you to have to handle it. You've been through enough. Take the rest of the day off and for the next few weeks work from home as much as possible. I'll make sure you have everything you need." Rachel looked like she wanted to argue, but something in his expression must have convinced her otherwise. "All right. But if you need me, if there's anything I can do to help, I'll call," Alexander promised. "Now go. And Rachel, be careful. David has friends in this city, people who might blame you for his downfall. Stay aware of your surroundings, and if anything feels wrong, contact me immediately." Concern flickered in her eyes, but she nodded and gathered her things. At the door she paused and looked back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Take care of yourself, Alexander. Don't let him win by destroying you from the inside." After she left, Alexander stood alone in his office, preparing for the battle to come. The press conference was brutal. Reporters shouted questions over each other. Cameras flashed incessantly, and Alexander felt like he was being dissected by 1,000 hostile eyes. He answered their questions with practiced composure, admitting to the embezzlement, expressing shock and betrayal at David's actions, and promising a thorough investigation to ensure nothing like this ever happened again. He did not mention Rachel's name. He had promised to protect her, and he intended to keep that promise. In the days that followed, the scandal dominated the news cycle. David Chen's arrest was front-page material, and speculation ran rampant about who might have been involved. Some reporters theorized that there was an inside informant. Others suggested that Alexander himself had discovered the theft. Rachel's name never came up. She stayed home as instructed, working remotely on administrative tasks while the storm raged around Mercer Industries. Alexander called her every evening to check in, ostensibly to discuss business matters, but really just to hear her voice. He found himself looking forward to those calls more than he should. The more he talked to her, the more he understood how much they had in common. Like him, Rachel had grown up with very little. Her father had abandoned the family when she was 12, leaving her mother to raise 3 children alone. Rachel had worked her way through college on scholarships and part-time jobs, graduating summa cum laude with a degree in business administration. She'd taken the secretarial position at Mercer Industries because it was the best opportunity available at the time, but she had ambitions far beyond answering phones and scheduling meetings. "I always wanted to start my own company," she confessed one night during their call. "Something small, maybe an art gallery or a studio where local artists could showcase their work. I've been saving money for years, but it never seems like enough." "You're an artist?" Alexander asked, surprised. "I paint sometimes when I have time. Mostly landscapes, the ocean, mountains, forests, places I'd like to visit someday. I'd love to see your work." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and he heard her soft intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Really? Most people think it's just a hobby. They don't take it seriously." "I take you seriously," Alexander said quietly. "Everything about you." The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken possibilities. Alexander knew he was treading dangerous ground. She was still his employee, still years younger than him, still caught up in a scandal that could define both their careers. But he couldn't deny what he felt for her. It was more than attraction, more than gratitude. It was a recognition, soul-deep and undeniable. Rachel was the woman he'd been waiting for all his life. He just hadn't known it until now. 2 weeks after David's arrest, Alexander finally found an excuse to see Rachel in person. The investigation was progressing well, and Special Agent Morrison needed Rachel to verify some additional documents. Alexander volunteered to accompany the agent to Rachel's apartment, telling himself it was purely professional. He wasn't fooling anyone, least of all himself. Rachel lived in a modest walk-up in Brooklyn, a far cry from the sleek Manhattan high-rises, where most Mercer Industries executives resided. The building was old, but well-maintained, with a narrow staircase that creaked under their feet and the faint smell of someone's dinner wafting through the halls. When Rachel opened the door, Alexander's breath caught in his throat. He'd only ever seen her in professional attire, tailored dresses, heels, her hair pinned back in that immaculate bun. But today she was wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, her auburn hair tumbling loose around her shoulders. She looked younger, softer, more approachable. She looked beautiful. Her apartment was small but filled with warmth and color. Paintings hung on every wall, not the mass-produced prints you'd find in a furniture store, but original works of art. Landscapes, just as she'd described. The ocean at sunset, a mountain meadow carpeted with wildflowers, a forest path dappled with golden light. Alexander found himself drawn to a painting of a lighthouse standing alone against a stormy sky. The detail was extraordinary. He could almost hear the waves crashing against the rocks. "You painted this?" he asked, unable to keep the awe from his voice. Rachel came to stand beside him, her shoulder almost brushing his. "Last winter, I rented a cabin in Maine for a weekend, just to get away from everything. There was this lighthouse on the point, and every evening I'd walk down to watch the sunset. It was the most peaceful place I've ever been." "It's incredible. You're incredibly talented." She ducked her head, a familiar blush creeping up her cheeks. "Thank you." "It's just a hobby, really." "This is more than a hobby," Alexander said firmly. "This is art, real art, the kind that makes people feel something." Special Agent Morrison cleared her throat pointedly, reminding them both why they were actually there. The next hour was spent reviewing documents, cross-referencing accounts, and answering questions about the timeline of Rachel's investigation. Alexander said little, content to watch Rachel work. Her intelligence was undeniable. She explained complex financial transactions with clarity and precision, never fumbling or second-guessing herself. When they were finally finished, Morrison gathered her documents and headed for the door. "Thank you, Ms. Bennett. Your cooperation has been invaluable. I'll be in touch if we need anything else." After the agent left, Alexander lingered. He knew he should go. There was no professional reason to stay, but his feet refused to move. "Would you like some coffee?" Rachel asked, her voice hesitant. "I was about to make some anyway. I'd like that." They sat in her tiny kitchen, mugs of steaming coffee between them, and talked for hours. Not about the case or the company, but about themselves, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Alexander told her about his divorce, how he'd married too young to a woman who loved his money more than him, how the failure had made him wary of relationships, convinced that he could never trust another person with his heart. Rachel told him about her father's abandonment, the years of struggle that followed, her determination to build a better life for herself and her family. She told him about her mother, who was now in a nursing home with early-onset Alzheimer's, which was why Rachel had been sending money home every month. "She doesn't always recognize me anymore," Rachel admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "But when she does, when she looks at me and says my name, it's like getting a piece of her back, even if it's only for a moment." Alexander reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I'm so sorry, Rachel, I had no idea." "How could you? That's not something I talk about. Most people don't want to hear about illness and loss. It makes them uncomfortable." "I want to hear about it," Alexander said quietly. "I want to hear everything about you, the good and the bad, the happy memories and the painful ones, all of it." Rachel's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Why? I'm just your secretary. Why would you care about my problems?" The question struck Alexander like a physical blow. How could she not know? How could she not see what was so blindingly obvious to him? "Because you're not just my secretary," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're the most remarkable woman I've ever met. You're brave and brilliant and beautiful, and every moment I spend with you makes me realize how empty my life was before you walked into it." He stood and moved around the table, pulling her gently to her feet. She didn't resist, her eyes wide and searching as she looked up at him. "I know this is complicated," he continued. "I know there are 1,000 reasons why we shouldn't be doing this, but I can't pretend anymore. I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel. I can't pretend that you're just an employee to me." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had begun to fall. "Tell me to stop and I will. Tell me this isn't what you want, and I'll walk out that door and never mention it again. But if you feel even a fraction of what I feel—" She silenced him with a kiss. It was soft at first, tentative, as if she was afraid he might disappear if she moved too quickly. But then his arms came around her, pulling her close, and the kiss deepened into something fierce and consuming. Years of loneliness, of guarding his heart, of convincing himself he was better off alone, all of it melted away in the warmth of her embrace. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rachel laughed, a bright, joyful sound that filled the small kitchen with light. "I've wanted to do that for months," she admitted. "Every time you walked into the office, every time you said my name, I had to remind myself to be professional. It was torture." Alexander smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in weeks. "Then we've both been suffering unnecessarily. We should have had this conversation a long time ago." Their relationship blossomed quickly after that night. They kept it secret at first, both aware of how it might look to the outside world. The billionaire CEO and his young secretary, the tabloids would have a field day. But keeping secrets proved difficult when every glance between them seemed charged with electricity, when Alexander found excuses to call her into his office just to see her smile. 3 weeks into their relationship, disaster struck. A reporter for a major business magazine had somehow obtained the security footage from the day of David's arrest. The footage that showed Rachel standing beside Alexander, clutching her folder of evidence. The footage that identified her as the whistleblower. Within hours, her name was everywhere. Her name was Rachel Bennett, the secretary who brought down a CFO. The media descended on her like vultures. Reporters camped outside her apartment building, shouting questions whenever she emerged. Her phone rang incessantly with requests for interviews, book deals, movie rights. Her private life was dissected in the press. Her father's abandonment, her mother's illness, even her weekend job at the diner, was somehow unearthed and turned into a narrative about the scrappy underdog who took on corporate America. And then came the threats. Not everyone admired Rachel's courage. David Chen had powerful friends, people who had profited from his schemes and now found their own positions precarious. Anonymous letters arrived at her apartment. Her car tires were slashed. One night, she came home to find her door unlocked, though nothing had been taken. Just a message, a warning that she wasn't safe. Alexander was beside himself with worry. He hired a security team to watch her around the clock, installed a state-of-the-art alarm system in her apartment, and begged her to move somewhere safer. But Rachel refused. "I won't let them intimidate me," she said, her jaw set with familiar determination. "If I run away, they win. If I hide, it sends a message that whistleblowers will be punished for doing the right thing. I won't be that message." Alexander admired her courage, even as it terrified him. He was falling deeper in love with her every day, and the thought of something happening to her was unbearable. But he also understood her need to stand her ground. It was one of the things he loved most about her, her refusal to back down no matter the cost. The situation came to a head one evening when Rachel was leaving the office. Alexander had insisted on walking her to her car, despite her protests that she could take care of herself. They were crossing the parking garage when a figure emerged from the shadows, a man in a dark coat, his face obscured by a baseball cap. "Miss Bennett." The man's voice was rough, unfamiliar. "I have a message for you." Alexander stepped in front of Rachel, his body tense and ready. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man ignored him, his eyes fixed on Rachel. "David Chen sends his regards. He wants you to know that prison doesn't last forever, and when he gets out—" He never finished the sentence. Alexander moved with a speed that surprised even himself, tackling the man and pinning him to the concrete floor. Security arrived within seconds, alerted by the commotion, and the would-be messenger was quickly subdued and handed over to the police. But the damage was done. Rachel was shaking, her face pale, and Alexander could see the fear she'd been trying so hard to hide. He wrapped his arms around her and held her close, whispering reassurances that he wasn't sure he believed himself. That night, Rachel finally agreed to leave her apartment. Not because she was afraid for herself, but because Alexander convinced her that the stress was affecting her mother. "If something happens to you, who will take care of her?" he asked gently. "Who will visit her, hold her hand, make sure she's comfortable? You're all she has, Rachel. You have to stay safe, for her sake, if not your own." It was a persuasive argument, and Rachel couldn't refute it. She packed a bag and moved into Alexander's penthouse apartment, a temporary arrangement that both of them knew might become permanent. Living together accelerated their relationship in ways neither had anticipated. Alexander learned that Rachel sang in the shower, old Motown classics that echoed through the marble bathroom and made him smile. He learned that she was a terrible cook, but an excellent baker, filling his kitchen with the smell of fresh bread and chocolate chip cookies. He learned that she talked in her sleep sometimes, mumbling about spreadsheets and evidence trails, her mind never fully at rest. Rachel learned that Alexander was secretly a romantic, leaving little notes for her to find, tucked into her briefcase, hidden in the pocket of her coat, slipped between the pages of her book. She learned that he was afraid of heights, despite living on the 40th floor, that he'd chosen the apartment for its location rather than its view. She learned that he still kept a photo of his college days with David in his desk drawer, unable to throw it away, despite everything that had happened. They were falling in love, deeply and irrevocably, in the midst of chaos and uncertainty. But Alexander knew that their happiness was fragile. The trial was approaching, and Rachel would have to testify against David. The threats might escalate, the media scrutiny would intensify, There were so many ways this could go wrong. The trial began on a blustery November morning. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan was swarming with reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers, hoping to catch a glimpse of the disgraced CFO. Alexander had offered to sit with Rachel in the courtroom, but she'd insisted he stay away. "You're too recognizable," she said. "If you're seen with me, it'll only fuel the rumors about us. The last thing we need is for the press to start speculating about our relationship." She was right, of course. Their relationship was still a secret, known only to a handful of trusted people. If it came out now, in the middle of the trial, it would overshadow everything else. The defense would use it to discredit Rachel, to suggest that her testimony was motivated by a desire to please her lover rather than a commitment to justice. So Alexander stayed away, watching the proceedings from his office on a live stream, his heart in his throat every time Rachel's name was mentioned. When she finally took the stand, he felt physically ill with worry. She looked so small up there, so vulnerable, facing down a team of expensive lawyers whose only goal was to destroy her credibility. But Rachel was magnificent. She answered every question with calm precision, never rising to the bait when the defense attorney tried to provoke her. She explained the evidence clearly and thoroughly, connecting the dots in a way that left no room for reasonable doubt. When the attorney suggested that she had fabricated the evidence to gain favor with her wealthy boss, Rachel's response was devastating. "I didn't know, Mr. Mercer would believe me when I brought him the evidence," she said quietly. "For all I knew, he might have been involved in the scheme himself. I was prepared to go to the FBI alone if I had to. I was prepared to lose my job, my reputation, everything. Because some things are more important than personal gain. Some things are worth sacrificing for." Alexander felt tears prick at his eyes as he watched her. This woman, this incredible woman, had risked everything for a principle. She owed nothing to him or to his company, and yet she had put herself in harm's way to do what was right. How had he ever suspected her of being a thief? The trial lasted 3 weeks. Alexander followed every moment, growing more proud of Rachel with each passing day. She faced down hostile cross-examinations, endured thinly veiled insults, and never once lost her composure. By the time the jury retired to deliberate, Alexander was convinced that David Chen would be spending the rest of his life behind bars. But what happened next shocked everyone. On the morning the verdict was expected, Alexander received a phone call that changed everything. It was his father, Harold Mercer, a man he hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. "We need to talk," Harold said, his voice gruff and commanding, the same tone he'd used when Alexander was a child. "About your secretary, about Rachel Bennett." Alexander's blood ran cold. His father had never approved of any woman in his life, not his ex-wife, not the string of casual girlfriends before her. Harold Mercer was old-fashioned in the worst ways, convinced that women were distractions that would weaken his son's focus on business. "What about her?" Alexander asked warily. "I know about your relationship. I've had people watching you for months, and I have information that you need to hear." An hour later, Alexander sat in his father's study in the family estate in Connecticut. The room hadn't changed since his childhood. Dark wood paneling, hunting trophies on the walls, the faint smell of cigar smoke and old money. Harold sat behind his massive desk, looking every one of his 72 years. "I'll get straight to the point," Harold said. "Rachel Bennett is not who she claims to be. She's been lying to you since the day she walked into your office." Alexander's hands clenched into fists. "What are you talking about?" Harold slid a folder across the desk. "Open it." Inside were documents, birth certificates, school records, financial statements, and photographs. Photographs of Rachel with a man Alexander had never seen before, a handsome stranger with dark hair and an easy smile. They were embracing in one photo, kissing in another. The dates on the back indicated they'd been taken less than a year ago. "His name is Marcus Webb," Harold said. "He's a private investigator, the same one I hired to look into Ms. Bennett's background." Alexander felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Marcus Webb, his head of security, the man who'd been helping him from the beginning, who'd been present when he'd faked his collapse, who'd had access to all the evidence. "According to my sources, Ms. Bennett and Mr. Webb have been romantically involved for over 2 years," Harold continued. "They planned this together. The investigation, the whistleblowing, all of it. Webb fed her information from inside your company, helped her build a case that would make her look like a hero. Their goal was to get close to you, to gain your trust and ultimately to take control of Mercer Industries. That's impossible, Alexander said, but his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. The evidence she found, David was guilty. The FBI confirmed it. David was guilty, Harold agreed. But that doesn't mean Ms. Bennett's motives were pure. She used real crimes to build her credibility, all while positioning herself to become your most trusted confidant. And now she's living in your apartment, sleeping in your bed, with access to all your private information. Tell me, son, how long before she convinces you to put her name on the company accounts? How long before you're signing over half your fortune in a divorce settlement? Alexander couldn't breathe. The room was spinning around him, the photographs burning in his hands like hot coals. Everything his father was saying made a horrible kind of sense. Rachel's convenient discovery of the embezzlement, her refusal to come forward until she had enough evidence to be credible, the way she'd wormed her way into his life, into his heart. Had it all been a lie? He thought of the way she looked at him, the warmth in her eyes when she said his name. He thought of her paintings, her stories about her mother, the tears she'd shed when she talked about her father's abandonment. Had any of it been real? Or had he been played by a master manipulator? I don't expect you to believe me right away, Harold said, his voice almost gentle. But I'm asking you to consider the possibility. Question everything she's told you. Look at the evidence with fresh eyes. And if you find that I'm wrong, if she truly is the honest, brave woman she claims to be, then I'll apologize and never interfere in your life again. Alexander drove back to the city in a daze. He couldn't think, couldn't process what he'd learned. Part of him wanted to confront Rachel immediately, to demand answers, but another part was afraid of what those answers might be. When he arrived at the penthouse, Rachel was waiting for him, her face alight with joy. "The verdict came in," she said, rushing toward him. "Guilty on all counts. David's going to prison for 20 years. She threw her arms around him, and for just a moment Alexander allowed himself to hold her. She felt so right in his arms, so perfect. How could this woman be a fraud? How could everything they'd shared be built on lies? But then he saw Marcus Webb's face in his mind, the head of security, the man he'd trusted, the man who'd been Rachel's lover, long before Alexander ever entered the picture, and he felt his heart turn to stone. He pulled back from Rachel's embrace, his expression cold and distant. She looked up at him in confusion, her smile fading. "Alexander, what's wrong?" "We need to talk," he said flatly. "About you and Marcus Webb." The color drained from Rachel's face. For a moment she looked like she might faint. Then her expression hardened into something Alexander had never seen before. Defiance, mixed with fear. "How do you know about Marcus?" "My father showed me photographs of you and him together, dated less than a year ago. He says you've been planning this from the beginning, the investigation, the whistleblowing, getting close to me. He says it was all a con." Rachel's eyes widened. "Your father? Alexander, your father hates women. He hated your ex-wife. He'll hate anyone you bring home. And yes, I knew Marcus before I started working at Mercer Industries. We dated briefly years ago, but I haven't seen him in months, and whatever photographs your father has must be old or doctored. He's trying to manipulate you." "Then explain why Marcus Webb is also my head of security," Alexander said coldly. "Explain why the man you dated is the same man who's been helping me investigate this case from the beginning. Is that just a coincidence, Rachel?" For a long moment, Rachel was silent. Then she sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear to God, Alexander, I didn't know Marcus worked for you. We broke up 3 years ago before I ever applied to Mercer Industries. When I saw him at your office, I was shocked. I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid of how it would look. I was afraid you wouldn't believe me." "You're right," Alexander said. "I don't believe you." The words hung in the air between them, sharp as knives. Rachel looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, her expression devastated. "Alexander, please. You know me. You know who I am. I would never lie to you about something like this." I love you." But Alexander couldn't hear her anymore. All he could hear was his father's voice, telling him that women were distractions, that love was weakness, that trust was for fools. He'd trusted David Chen for 15 years, and David had stolen $2 million from him. Why should Rachel be any different? "I want you out of this apartment by tomorrow morning," he said, his voice empty of emotion. "Consider your employment at Mercer Industries terminated. My lawyers will be in touch regarding a non-disclosure agreement. If you speak to the press about our relationship, I will destroy you." Rachel stood slowly, her entire body trembling. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "I know you're hurt and confused, but you're making the biggest mistake of your life. I'm not the enemy, Alexander. I never was." She walked past him toward the bedroom, pausing at the door. "I'll pack my things tonight, but before I go, I want you to know something. I meant every word I ever said to you. I love you. And someday when you realize the truth, I hope you can forgive yourself for what you're doing right now." She closed the door behind her, leaving Alexander alone with his doubts and his father's poisonous words echoing in his head. That night, lying alone in the vast bed that still smelled of Rachel's perfume, Alexander told himself he'd made the right decision. He couldn't afford to be fooled again. He couldn't afford to be weak. But somewhere deep in his heart, a voice whispered that he'd just thrown away the best thing that had ever happened to him, and he was terrified that voice might be right. The weeks that followed were the loneliest of Alexander's life. He threw himself into work with a ferocity that alarmed even his most dedicated employees. He arrived at the office before dawn and left long after midnight. He took meetings that could have been emails, reviewed documents that didn't need his attention, and made decisions that his team was perfectly capable of handling on their own. Anything to avoid going home to that empty apartment. Anything to avoid thinking about Rachel. But no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't escape her. She was everywhere, in the coffee mug that had been her favorite, in the closet where her dresses still hung because he couldn't bring himself to have them removed, in the lingering scent of her perfume that seemed to have seeped into the very walls. He dreamed of her every night, waking with her name on his lips and an ache in his chest that nothing could ease. Marcus Webb had resigned the day after Rachel left. He'd submitted a brief letter of resignation, citing personal reasons, and had disappeared before Alexander could confront him. The photographs, the conspiracy, the elaborate scheme his father had described, Alexander had no way of verifying any of it. And the more time passed, the more he began to doubt. He'd done some investigating of his own in the weeks since Rachel's departure. He'd contacted former colleagues of Marcus Webb, tracked down old employment records, even hired a different private investigator to look into the man's background. What he'd found had shaken him to his core. Marcus Webb had indeed dated Rachel Bennett, but more than 4 years ago, not one. They'd broken up amicably after 6 months, both agreeing that they were better suited as friends than lovers. The photographs his father had shown him were real, but the dates had been altered. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make it look like Rachel and Marcus's relationship was recent and ongoing, and there was more. The private investigator had discovered that Marcus Webb was Harold Mercer's godson. They'd known each other for decades. Marcus had been placed at Mercer Industries at Harold's request, years before Alexander had even met Rachel. The conspiracy wasn't what his father had claimed. The real conspiracy was Harold's attempt to destroy his son's relationship with the only woman who'd ever truly loved him. Alexander felt sick when he realized the truth. His father had manipulated him, had played on his insecurities and his fear of betrayal to drive away the best thing in his life. And Alexander had let him. He'd been so afraid of being fooled that he'd fooled himself, convinced himself that Rachel was the enemy when she'd been his greatest ally all along. He needed to find her. He needed to apologize, to beg her forgiveness, to tell her that he'd been wrong about everything. But when he tried to contact her, he discovered that she'd vanished. Her phone was disconnected. Her apartment had been vacated. The nursing home where her mother lived had no forwarding address on file. Rachel Bennett had disappeared, and Alexander had no idea how to find her. He spent months searching. He hired investigators, called in favors, even reached out to Special Agent Morrison to see if the FBI had any record of Rachel's whereabouts. Nothing. It was as if she'd been erased from existence. The guilt was crushing. Every day that passed without finding her was another day of torment. Alexander stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping, stopped caring about the company that had once been his entire world. What was the point of success if he had no one to share it with? What was the point of anything? On a grey February morning, 6 months after Rachel had walked out of his life, Alexander found himself standing outside his father's estate in Connecticut. He hadn't planned to come here, hadn't spoken to Harold since the day he'd destroyed everything, but something had drawn him to this place. Maybe it was the need for closure. Maybe it was the desire to confront the man who'd ruined his life. Or maybe it was just the desperate hope that Harold might know something, might have some clue about where Rachel had gone. The door was opened by a nurse Alexander didn't recognize. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm here to see my father, Harold Mercer." The nurse's expression softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry, sir. Your father had a stroke 3 weeks ago. He's been in and out of consciousness ever since." Alexander felt the ground shift beneath his feet. A stroke? Why wasn't I notified? He gave strict instructions that you were not to be contacted. But since you're here, she stepped aside to let him in. "He's in the master bedroom. I should warn you, he may not recognize you." Alexander climbed the stairs he'd climbed 1,000 times as a child, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. He hated his father for what he'd done, but hate wasn't a simple thing. It was tangled up with love and grief, and the desperate wish that things could have been different. Harold lay in the massive 4-poster bed that had belonged to the Mercer family for generations. He looked ancient, shrunken, nothing like the commanding figure who had dominated Alexander's childhood. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow, his skin the color of old parchment. Alexander sat in the chair beside the bed and waited. After what seemed like hours, Harold's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy, unfocused, but when they landed on Alexander, they cleared with recognition. "Son." The word was barely a whisper. "I'm here," Alexander said, though he wasn't sure why. "Had to see you," Harold rasped. "Had to tell you, before it's too late." He struggled to sit up, and Alexander instinctively reached out to help him. Even now, after everything, the impulse to care for his father was automatic. "The girl," Harold continued, his voice growing stronger with effort. "Rachel, I was wrong. Wrong about everything." Alexander's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "I thought I was protecting you, protecting the family. But I was afraid." Tears began to leak from the corners of Harold's eyes. "Afraid of losing you, afraid that she would take you away from me. So I lied, I manipulated. I destroyed something beautiful because I was a jealous old man who couldn't let go of his son." He gripped Alexander's hand with surprising strength. "She loved you, really loved you. I could see it in her eyes and it terrified me. No woman had ever looked at you that way. Not your mother, not your ex-wife. And I knew that if you married her, you'd be gone forever. You'd have your own family, your own life, and you wouldn't need me anymore. Father." "Let me finish. I don't have much time." Harold's grip tightened. "I paid Marcus to fabricate the evidence, altered the photographs, fed you lies that I knew you'd believe because I knew your weaknesses. I knew you were afraid of being betrayed again, and I used that fear against you." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy as a death sentence. Alexander felt tears streaming down his own face, though he couldn't have said whether they were tears of grief or rage or something else entirely. "I tried to find her," Harold whispered, "after you left. I tried to make it right. But she's gone. She changed her name, moved away, started a new life, started a—" He pulled something from beneath his pillow, a folded piece of paper worn soft from handling. "This came 6 months ago. I've been carrying it ever since, trying to work up the courage to give it to you." Alexander took the paper with trembling hands. It was a letter handwritten in Rachel's familiar script. "Dear Mr. Mercer," he read aloud, his voice breaking. "I don't blame your son for what happened. I blame you. You saw something good and beautiful, and you destroyed it because you couldn't stand to see your son happy with someone other than yourself. I hope you can live with that. I hope the guilt keeps you awake at night the way it keeps me awake, because I loved Alexander. I loved him more than I've ever loved anything or anyone, and now I have to spend the rest of my life trying to forget him, knowing that he's out there somewhere, believing I betrayed him. I'm enclosing my new address. Not because I want anything from you, but because I want you to know that I survived. I rebuilt my life. I'm okay. And someday maybe I'll be able to think about Alexander without feeling like my heart is being ripped out of my chest. But that day isn't today. Rachel Bennett. P.S. Don't try to contact me. Don't send anyone to find me. If Alexander ever wants to see me again, he knows where to look. He just has to remember what I told him about the most peaceful place I've ever been. Alexander looked up from the letter, his mind racing. The most peaceful place she'd ever been. The lighthouse. The cabin in Maine. The painting that had hung on her wall. The one she'd created after a weekend of watching sunsets and finding peace. He knew where she was. Go, Harold whispered. Find her. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her. But Alexander didn't wait to hear the rest. He was already running, down the stairs, out the door, into his car. He drove through the night, barely stopping for gas, pushing the speed limit as far as he dared. By dawn he was crossing into Maine, and by mid-morning he'd reached the coastal town where Rachel had rented her cabin all those years ago. The lighthouse was exactly as she'd painted it, tall and proud against a steel-grey sky, standing sentinel over a churning sea. Alexander parked his car and walked down the rocky path toward the point, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He saw her before she saw him. She was standing at the edge of the cliff, wrapped in a heavy coat, her auburn hair loose and wild in the wind. She was holding a paintbrush, adding the finishing touches to a canvas that captured the scene before her, the lighthouse, the sea, the endless horizon. She looked older than he remembered, not in a bad way, just more settled, more at peace. The worried lines that had creased her forehead during the trial were gone. She looked like a woman who had found her place in the world. Alexander took a step closer, and a twig snapped under his foot. Rachel spun around, her brush clattering to the ground. Her face went through a cascade of emotions, shock, fear, hope, and finally something that looked like relief. "Alexander," she breathed. "Rachel." He took another step toward her, then another until they were standing face to face with nothing between them but the wind and the weight of everything that had gone unsaid. "I'm sorry," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm so sorry. I was wrong about everything. My father lied to me, manipulated me, and I was too afraid to see the truth. I should have trusted you. I should have believed in us. Instead, I threw away the only real thing I've ever had." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "How did you find me?" "The lighthouse. You told me it was the most peaceful place you'd ever been. When I read your letter, the one you sent to my father, I knew." He reached out and took her hand, half expecting her to pull away. But she didn't. Her fingers curled around his, holding on as if she'd never let go. "I know I don't deserve a second chance," he continued. "I know I hurt you in ways that might never heal, but I love you, Rachel. I've loved you since the day you knelt beside me on that office floor and called your mother instead of 911. I loved you when you stood up to David Chen. I loved you when you moved into my apartment and filled it with the smell of fresh bread and Motown music. And I've loved you every single day since you left, even when I was too stupid and scared to admit it." Rachel was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling too. "I tried so hard to hate you," she said. "I told myself you weren't worth missing, but I missed you anyway, every day, every hour. You were everywhere, in every sunset, every cup of coffee, every time I picked up a paintbrush." "Then let me make it right," Alexander said. "Let me spend the rest of my life making it up to you. I'll move here if that's what you want. I'll sell the company, leave New York, start over. Nothing matters to me except being with you." Rachel laughed through her tears. "You'd really give up your empire for me?" "In a heartbeat. You're worth more than any company, any fortune, any success. You're worth everything, Rachel. You always have been." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "You look tired," she said softly. I couldn't sleep without you. Neither could I. They stood there for a long moment, foreheads touching, breathing the same salt-tinged air. Then Rachel rose on her tiptoes and kissed him, gently at first, then with all the passion and longing of their months apart. Alexander wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close, feeling for the first time in 6 months like he could finally breathe. When they broke apart, Rachel was laughing. I can't believe you drove all night to find me. I'd drive to the ends of the earth for you. Don't you know that by now? She took his hand and led him toward the small cottage, nestled among the pines at the edge of the cliff. Come inside, she said. I'll make you some coffee. And then you can tell me everything. About your father, about what happened, about how you finally figured out the truth. As they walked through the door together, Alexander felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. Hope for the future. Hope for second chances. Hope that love could survive even the darkest betrayals. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know if Rachel would forgive him completely, or if the wounds he'd inflicted would ever fully heal. But he knew one thing for certain. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, with the woman he was meant to spend his life with. Rachel poured 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him on the worn couch, her head resting on his shoulder, their fingers intertwined. Outside, the lighthouse stood watch over the churning sea, a beacon of hope in an uncertain world. Alexander turned to Rachel, lifted her chin with gentle fingers, and kissed her one more time as the morning sun finally broke through the clouds and filled the cottage with golden light.